Thank you so much for your introduction. Thank you for your leadership. I'm so thrilled to be here with Young Dems, with Fresno County Dems, with Stonewall Dems in the house, I think. Fresno has already treated us so well, and I can't think of a better place to host our nationally televised town hall tonight than right here in this community. We're here because even though we're a long way from home, this is also a community that reminds me of where I come from. A place that has seen its share of struggle, that's seen its share of poverty and inequality and challenges, and sometimes is forgotten because there are other communities that get a little bit more attention, but also a place where people lift each other up, a place where people know that there is unity in diversity. And a place where people are focused on the future and making sure that it's better. So even though we're thousands of miles from South Bend, Indiana, I feel completely at home here in Fresno. I'm so thankful for the welcome. So we knew we had this event tonight. We said, let's do a meet and greet. Let's see if anybody will come if we organize a little round table. And this is our little meet and greet. Not bad for a Monday. And I think it shows how much energy there is in our party, how much enthusiasm there is in our communities right now to make sure we build a future that is better than the past and to stand for our values. Our values are going to motivate this campaign, and they are going to help us take back the White House. And it can't come a moment too soon. We aren't just joining the conversation, we are changing the conversation. We're changing the conversation about freedom. Because our conservative friends, and we live in communities where we got a lot of conservative neighbors and relatives and friends, they're not bad people, but they've gotten a little bit lost on some of these ideas, like freedom. So they care about freedom, but their imagination has grown so narrow that they have forgotten that you need good government policy to secure freedom, just like bad government can take freedom away. Freedom does not belong to one political party. And we know that you're not free if you don't have health care. That means you wouldn't be able to start a small business because you'd be afraid that leaving your old job means losing your coverage. And that's why health care is part of what it takes to live free in this country. We know that you're not free in this country if your reproductive rights are being dictated by male politicians. You can say that you're free in this country if a county clerk gets to tell you who you ought to marry based on their view of their religion. We have a richer understanding of what it means to be free, and we stand up for one another's freedom, whether it affects us or not. Because I am a man, it is twice as important that I stand up for reproductive freedom. Because I was born here and I have the paperwork to show that I am an American, it is twice as important that I stand up for dreamers who are as American as I am but don't have the documentation to show it. Because I am not from a community of color, it is twice as important that I stand up with an agenda for black Americans that erases racial injustice in this country. Because of my own life experience, I know what it is to be on the other side of a fence. I know what it is to be on the other side of a crisis of belonging in this country, and all of us do in different ways for different reasons. And that's part of what's made this presidency so effective, is tapping into the hurt that each of us have for a different reason. Whether it is the hurt of someone who is living with a veil of mistrust between their African-American family and the police officer sworn to keep them safe. or a transgender kid in a high school who just has to go to the bathroom like everybody else, or whether it is an auto worker in the American Midwest who loses his job 12 years into a career and no longer is able to explain who he is. Now, there are two things we can do with that sense of anxiety. One thing we can do is prey on those insecurities to drive us apart. And countries are like human beings. We're at our worst when we are insecure. But the other thing we can do is we can tap into our own stories, the things that have put us on the other side of somebody else's equation, whether it was in the workplace or in the family or in our community or in our neighborhood or in our own story, and use that as a way to understand what everybody else is going through, to stand up for each other precisely because we are different. And when we do that, we are more free. That was the message that the farm workers standing shoulder to shoulder with the civil rights movement taught us generations ago. And I saw it in this very state just a couple of weeks ago in Los Angeles, where they're fighting for more resources, getting into classrooms, not just with teachers, but for professionals and for better pay for janitors. SEIU, shoulder to shoulder with teachers, shoulder to shoulder with carpenters, because we stand up for each other, and that is how we get our freedom. These are the values that bring us into the process, our commitment to freedom, our commitment to one another's security, and knowing what security means. Not allowing them to wrap themselves in the flag as if patriotism belonged to one political party. It is an American value, not a conservative. Do we have any veterans in the house today? Outstanding. Thank you for serving. All right. Thank you for serving. Thank you for wearing that flag that, among other things, represents the idea of free speech and political dissent in this country, and that you can stand for your beliefs, even or especially if that means criticizing your political leaders, and no one will question whether you are loyal to the republic for which it stands. Now, if we want to talk about keeping America safe, we know there's a lot more to that than putting up a wall from sea to shining sea. Let's keep each other safe from cybersecurity threats, from election security threats, from foreign interference. Let's keep each other safe from white nationalist violence that is claiming lives here and around the world. Yes, from parts of California exposed to wildfire danger to parts of Indiana that have been underwater far too many times in these recent years because of climate disruption. Let's treat climate like the security issue that it is. Freedom does not belong to one political party. Patriotism does not belong to one political party. God does not belong to a political party. People of any religion and people of no religion can come equally before American democracy in the public square and have our voices heard. That's the idea. But many of us believe that our faith guides us to seek leaders who demonstrate decency and humility and a commitment to lifting up the least among us. That is true in every faith tradition. And whether you subscribe to a faith tradition or not, we all know hypocrisy when we see it, and we're seeing an awful lot of it in Washington today. So we're going to have to get out there and tune up our democracy. Because you can't just take democracy for granted. It needs to be fixed up from time to time. And as long as districts are drawn so that politicians choose their voters instead of voters choosing politicians, our democracy needs to be repaired. As long as every Supreme Court vacancy turns into an apocalyptic ideological firefight, our democracy needs to be repaired. Now, I would argue a good start on repairing American democracy would be to empower people wherever they live, whether you are in the Central Valley or whether you are in northern Indiana, to have an equal voice in choosing the American president by choosing the president through a national popular vote. There are a lot of Democrats competing for the nomination right now. Now that California is an early state, you may have noticed it's kind of starting to look like a parade. And the good news is most of our values line up pretty well. Yes, there are going to be some differences in priorities. Yes, there will be some differences in opinion. But for the most part, we are largely united in where we want to see this country go. So another very important thing that we ought to be thinking about right now is, how do we win? Because, you know, we got friends, I think, you know what I mean, maybe if you visit some other places along the coast where we have friends who are fellow Democrats who have trouble believing that Trump voters even exist. It's such a hard thing to get your head around in some places. But of course, the truth is we've got to face the fact that this president could absolutely win again. He's unpopular. He deserves to be unpopular. But he could win again. And here's how I think that could happen. I think it happens if we look like we represent the system. I think it happens if we look like we represent going back to normal. Because even though what we have now cannot continue, it's unbearable, it's chaotic, it's corrupt, it's a mess, it's wrong. But even though all of that is true, I think there are a lot of Americans who are not willing to go back to a normal that has failed them over the course of our lives. Communities where it's as if the economic recovery of our lifetimes never even happened. Communities that feel like Democratic and Republican administrations have not been speaking to them. And so we in our party cannot go around promising to turn back the clock to the 2000s or the 90s any more than they can keep a promise to turn back the clock to the 1950s. We've got to do something completely different. Now, the good news is, I would argue that you have the option to support a candidate who could not be more different than the current President of the United States. So we're not going to play his game. We're not going to go tweet for tweet or taunt for taunt. We're not going to match insult with insult. When we see that horror show going on, we're not going to go on the show and try to play his game. We're going to pick up the remote and we're going to change the channel. With your help. So are you ready to change the channel? Yeah! Are you ready to bring a little bit of hope into this process? Are you prepared to reach out to your neighbors and your friends and urge them to find something completely different than what we have in Washington? Then you can help me build this campaign from something that has already surprised people from coast to coast into something that's going to take us to the nomination and all the way to the White House, with your help. Now, we set this up as a roundtable. I didn't come here to talk at you. I'd love to have a conversation, even though there's a lot of folks in the room. I'm sure we can find a way to do it. Do we have a mic going around, or should we just ask people? All right, you're just going to have to talk loud, but stick your hand up, and we'll take as many questions as we can get to, starting with you right in front of me. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my parents and grandparents are Hoosiers. They were all born in Terre Haute,
Wonderful.
Indiana. And my dad was a Marine, and I am on the Central Committee for the Fresno County Democratic Women's Club.
Thank you. So
my question has to be that South Bend is about a sixth of the size of Fresno. And since you haven't won a statewide election, what can you say about your possibilities of winning?
Sure thing. Great. Thanks for the question. So one of the ideas of this campaign is that we can't keep doing what we've been doing before. I get that a more traditional candidate would be somebody who's been kind of soaking in Washington for a long time, right? Although it's interesting, I probably wouldn't get that question if I were a member of Congress, right? But you could be one of the most senior members of the United States Congress and have never in your life managed more than a few dozen people, maybe 100. When you were a mayor of a city of any size, especially in our system in Indiana where we don't have city managers, you're looking at the city manager, it means that you face the challenges of government in the most up-close and personal way. One minute you're dealing with an economic development puzzle, negotiating with the developer. And then you'll have something right out of Parks and Recreation. We're moving a duck pond right now, and it's a big fight. And then just when you're having a good laugh over that, that's when you find out there's been a potentially racially explosive officer-involved shooting, and you've got a matter of minutes to decide in your mind what you're going to say on television to hold a community together when you don't even have all the facts. And the next day you get up in the morning and there's something new. And so while nothing can truly be like the American presidency, nobody walks in there with experience in what it's like to be president unless they've been president. I would argue that in today's times, there's no better preparation in government than being a mayor, and that it's actually even more helpful to have mayors who can speak for the kinds of communities that this president tried to co-opt, tried to go after with his message of nostalgia, of make America great again, turn back the clock and everything will be fine. That was a message aimed right at the heart of my community, which lost our identity and so many of our jobs when the auto companies left. Happened before I was born, and we're still picking up the pieces, but we've figured out a way to grow. And the way we figured out how to grow is to be very honest about how the past isn't coming back, but how we can support each other and give workers a winning place in a future economy, not the role of victim, but a role that works. Even though we got a long way to go, our poverty rate is about the same as Fresno. So we know what one another's communities are up against. But our city is living proof that there's no such thing as an honest politics that revolves around the idea again. And so I think that story, precisely because I haven't been debating these issues in committees in Washington, I've been trying to manage them on the ground, coupled with the fact that anyone who has ever been ordered into a war by the pen of an American president knows a little something about what's at stake in that office, gives me a certain perspective that I think is as useful as that of anyone else seeking this job. Thank you.
My name is Anastasia, and I graduate from high school tomorrow.
All right, congratulations.
As the daughter of a nurse and someone who's about to enter the workforce, I'm concerned about the ever-decreasing rates of union members and good union jobs in our country. Today, only 10.5% of the workforce in the United States are in unions. What is your plan to reinvigorate the labor movement? And will you support repealing anti-union legislation like Taft-Hartley?
Thank you. Thank you, and congratulations on your upcoming graduation.
Thank you.
The short answer to your question is yes.
Yeah.
Look, the decline of the middle class and the American dream over the last 30, 40 years, and the decline of membership in organized labor have moved more or less together, and that's not a coincidence. It's also not a coincidence that a lot of anti-labor legislation and government took place and then union membership dropped. It's not like it just happened. And we've got to remember that organized labor brought us the relationship to the workplace that's supposed to make the middle class lifestyle possible. The weekend, the idea of a 40-hour work week, basic labor protection, safety, child labor, these things came about not on their own, but because people stood up and demanded them. And that's even more important today. Now, the economy is changing around us in so many ways. You and I are likely to change careers more often than our parents changed job titles. And that means labor's got to be ready for that too. But in my view, labor could be a huge part of the answer. It's why organizing gig workers is a very good idea. It's why organizing even the unemployed could be very promising. But especially in the professions and the trades, from nursing to construction trades, to industrial unions, we know what a difference it makes to have organized labor standing up for people. And by the way, employers ought to welcome this. You know, I'm a union employer because I run a city. And so we actually, not only were many parts of our workforce organized when I got there, but we created a new 911 center, and those workers chose to organize. And as soon as they did, they had a voice. They had one of the most stressful jobs in government. I mean, imagine what it's like all day, handling 911 calls. And they were able, because they came together in an AFSCME organization. Any AFSCME in the house? Yeah. All right, couple, good. They were able to stand up for themselves, and it was easier for us in elected leadership to figure out how to be good employers. So this is vitally important. I believe we need a new Wagner Act that will help empower labor to organize, not just within firms, but across industries. And then if we get this right, it will be a big part of the solution to the skills and benefits challenges created by the 21st century economy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick follow-up on Pat's comment.
Yeah.
You don't have foreign affairs experience, but oh, you were in the military overseas. You have more than Donald Trump had.
It's a certain kind of foreign affairs experience.
Legislators that voted all these abortion restrictions,
Yeah.
I noticed they don't fund family planning, which reduces unwanted pregnancies and the demand for abortion. They don't fund prenatal care. They don't fund programs to help low-income mothers that just have a baby. I'm wondering, we need to stop calling them pro-life. They're pro-birth. That's all they're doing.
That's right. We have a responsibility to support mothers and to make sure that we have the right kind of birth control and sex education. If you don't like Planned Parenthood, think about unplanned parenthood and the pressures that creates on our communities. So the work that is done, whether it's by Planned Parenthood or the work that ought to be done, supported by government policies to make sure we have the right kind of health care. Full health care. Health care where being a woman is not a disqualifying pre-existing condition. That's part of what it means to be truly pro-life, in my opinion. All right. Right there along the wall. Yep, you're up. Yep. You.
I know you support legalizing marijuana, and
Yeah.
you proposed that you would try to support specifically Black and Brown communities getting out of prison. So
Yeah.
I think Congresswoman Ilhan supported like expunging criminal records. I know
Yes.
that's like a state responsibility, but what would you do to help support those people getting out of that system?
Yes, so what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that when we start ending the most harmful mistakes of the war on drugs, like legalizing marijuana, which I believe is the right thing to do, we also make sure that we're looking into the past, that we're looking at people who are suffering today in cases where the incarceration is doing more harm than the offense. You know, when that crime bill passed, I was 12 years old. We are now seeing the generation that has been produced by mass incarceration going through the roof. And on the spectrum of childhood experiences that can set you back in life, that can make you more vulnerable to everything from mental illness to winding up in the criminal justice system yourself, the incarceration of a parent is one of the worst things that can happen to you. And so we do need expungement for nonviolent drug offenses. We need opportunities for people to get back into society, but when we do that, we need to support them, right? Right now, if you have a record, can you hear me?
No.
All right, so think about this. One of the things that was passed in Washington was that if you have a record, you're not eligible for Section 8 housing, subsidized housing, right? So imagine you're trying to get back on your feet. You served a sentence. The biggest thing we want to happen is for you to get a job and have a good life and re-enter society. And we just made it harder for you to get affordable housing. We are pushing you back into prison, in a certain sense, with costs for all of us. So we've got to, and of course, all of these patterns have a very strong racial bias associated with it. You are 4 times as likely to wind up with a sentence, with an incarceration, as a consequence of a nonviolent drug offense if you're black than if you're white. And if we want to live in a fairer country, we've got to proactively work to reverse. It's not enough to follow up a racist policy with a neutral policy. We got to have an anti-racist set of policies to start reversing those harms. Right here in the front.
Just despite the current president, all the lying and the tweeting and all that crap going on, and ultimately no incumbent president has not won re-election when the economy is strong.
Great. So the question, if you didn't hear it, is about the economy. The president's going to use the economy as a selling point. He's going to say we have a great economy. And if he has one achievement, it is that he has managed so far not to completely tank the Obama recovery. So far. Although a lot of that was through things like unaffordable corporate tax cuts for very wealthy people that are going to have a bill that comes due on the next president's watch, most likely. But I think the real question is this. What good does it do you to have the GDP number going up or the stock market looking good if you're not getting ahead? How did we get a so-called economic anxiety election in 2016 when the economists said we were at full employment? I think what we're learning is there's more to the story than what shows up in some of those numbers. And there are places from the Central Valley to the west side of South Bend where it's as if that recovery never even happened. And we've got to talk about what it means for the economy to actually work for us. We're the ones trying to get you a raise. We're the ones who think you deserve paid family leave. We're the ones trying to hold on to your health care. And even though they say a rising tide lifts all boats, it turns out it doesn't work that way. And we know that from the numbers, because in my lifetime, the rising tide's risen like a rising tide has never risen before in our economy. And most of the boats didn't even budge. Like they were roped down to the ocean floor. They didn't move. Wages are flat since the 70s for most of us. So we got to talk about what it means for the economy to actually work for us. And if we get that right, then we will start seeing some other things. For example, another number that we ought to be watching just as closely as GDP. Life expectancy. Do you know life expectancy is going down? Think about that. People are going to die younger if this trajectory keeps going on. What does that tell you about what the economy is doing and what the economy is not doing? So to me, we got to talk about the economy of everyday life, just like we talk about the politics of everyday life. And we might even wind up asking that question that Ronald Reagan famously asked. Are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Are you better off than you were 10 years ago? And I think for too many Americans, the answer is that we are no better off, and that's why we've got to change the structures that perpetuate inequality in our economy and in our government. Okay.
Hi, this is great. I'm a member of the Armenian community, and for decades long we've received neglect from the American government to even recognize the genocide that happened to our people. I was wondering, you as a president, would you be able to step up that plate and even just give simple recognition to my community?
Right. So the question, if you didn't hear it, belongs to the Armenian community that has been denied recognition, even 100 years on, of the genocide that was perpetrated against that community. And to me, the United States needs to stand up for human rights. And I think of a historian I studied as a student who said that one of the reasons you need to pay attention to history is that even the dead are not safe from the enemy if he wins. There is a relationship between how we pay attention to history and how we live in the present. And I believe the world would be better off if America put its money where its mouth was when it came to human rights and democracy. You know, not just at home, these things are in retreat, right? China's throwing their weight around, Saudi Arabia's behaving with impunity, Russia, obviously, not the most democratic or pro-human rights entity out there, and they're doing things in order to show that they can, that we won't do anything about it. And without carelessly invading other countries, there are lots of things we can do with economic and social and diplomatic tools. Sometimes something as simple as recognizing the truth that help create human rights diplomacy that makes countries want to do the right thing and have to explain themselves if they fail to do the right thing. And that is part of how foreign policy will work on my watch. That's right. Edward, you're up.
I'm the chair of the Tulare County Stonewall. My question is, up at the convention, 2 young men were beaten for being gay. will you take the time to contact the mayor and the police chief there and ask for that to be treated as a hate crime? Also, we have a lot of our quote-unquote allies that kill us. What would you do to try to alleviate that issue overseas?
Yes, so thank you. First of all, I wasn't aware of that incident, so I'll learn about that right away. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Okay, good. It's just an example of how 50 years after Stonewall, on one hand, it's unbelievable the progress that's been made, right? I mean, you're looking at a out presidential candidate with his, allow me to introduce Chasten, by the way. He's pretty great, isn't he? In Indiana, while Mike Pence was governor, I got reelected with 80% of the vote the same year that I came out. So the progress has been unbelievable, and yet, people are being beaten. Not just abroad, where we have egregious human rights violations against LGBTQ people, but right here, even in South Bend, a couple of years ago. And sadly, Indiana is one of the 5 states that still doesn't have a hate crime law. And so it's hard to get it treated for what it was, but somebody was beaten to death. And it had to do with his being gay. So we got to ask what equality really means. And we've got to insist on equality. And part of the meaning of pride, pride is at the mall now, and companies are stepping over themselves to show how supportive they are. And in a way, that's great. But marching is about bringing about change. Marching is about standing up for rights. And until the war on trans Americans is over, until discrimination is not lawful in this country, until anybody can walk without fear, knowing that they can be who they are, we got our work cut out for us, and I'll be there every step of the way. All the way in the back. Yep, you're going to have to be loud, though.
So, women of color in Congress have currently been leading the charge in promoting a lot of the most progressive policies in the country. So this would include Tulsi Gabbard criticizing American intervention in Venezuela. This would include Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez criticizing the unjust treatment that the Palestinians have faced in Israel. And also Ilhan Omar and her have criticized ICE in particular the unjust treatment of undocumented immigrants. So if you were to become president, how would you turn these policies and this rhetoric into actual policies that would change the future of the United States?
Yeah, there's a lot there. First of all, the beginning part of your question is really important. Part of why issues are being talked about in new ways, we have new faces in Washington. We were proud to support a number of women of color last year, and they're changing the face of Congress, and it's a good thing. There's 3 things I want to point to that are going to be important. The first, of course, is just do no harm, right? The first is to stop the bad policies. So when we talk about ICE, whether it's in its current form or some other form, when our immigration authorities are given an inhumane, and in my view, in many ways, illegal set of policies to carry out, the results are going to be horrifying. I mean, to now be up to 7 children lost in U.S. government custody. The most powerful country in the world ought to have nothing to fear from a child fleeing violence in Central America. But also, a child fleeing violence ought to have nothing to fear when they are in the arms of the most powerful country in the world. You know, first and only time under the Obama administration, we had a lot of issues with race and policing in our city, and I could turn to them for help. They helped us figure out body cameras. They helped us figure out 21st century policing. They helped us find resources on implicit bias training. The only time I heard from this administration's Department of Justice was when they sent a letter saying they'd take away our police grant funding unless I signed up to help them with immigration enforcement using our own South Bend Police Department. As you can imagine, I did not sign that letter. So, part one, end the bad policies. Part two, we got to replace them with good ones. And again, not just neutral ones, but ones that reverse the harms. That's why we have to proactively work to create, on immigration, for example, a pathway to citizenship for undocumented people in this country. That's why we got to protect dreamers and make sure they have a pathway to citizenship. That's why we got to reinstitute the family case management plan that kept families out of danger, and by the way, had an incredibly good track record on making sure that they were also there for their hearings when we had things like asylum cases. We know what good policy looks like. Most Americans will support it. We just got to do it. Same thing on some of the international affairs you've been talking about, right? Part of it's do no harm, like maybe don't give away something very important in our Middle East relationships without getting something in return. I got to point this in a certain direction, then it works. All right, we'll try that. But also recognizing in our relationship with Israel that in the same way that being patriotic in this country doesn't have to mean you support this current government here, believing in a U.S.-Israel alliance does not mean you have to support the policies of the Israeli right wing. Now, I talk about dropping bad policies, establishing good policies. The other thing we have to do is just the cultural part, just the leadership part. Having a president, and it took me a while to learn this as a mayor, because I'm a policy guy. I usually just went right to the policy, stuff I could count, stuff in black and white, stuff I could measure. Sometimes it just matters what the president says or doesn't say. It matters what a mayor does or doesn't say, to hold people together or to allow them to be pulled apart. And this is where I believe a president can most earn their paycheck, is by establishing, just by example, by tone, that hate has no home in the United States of America. That things like white nationalism are both a security threat and an affront to what it means to be an American. And that everyone deserves to be treated equally and with dignity in this country. Not only is that a matter of policy, it is a moral question, and we need leadership that sets the right tone, yes, in Congress, and also in the White House. All right. Down to our last question. I see white shirt right there. Yes, ma'am.
Which one?
You're up.
All right. Going in, to quote Dickens, a best of time, worst of time scenario. You get elected, but so does Mitch McConnell and the Senate. What do you do then?
Yeah.
I mean, nothing personal, but Barack Obama tried really hard and it didn't fly.
Right. Question if you didn't hear is what do you do if you have a divided Congress? And if the Senate is so it won't be easy. Look, I've worked with Republicans a lot. I'm on my third Republican governor back home in Indiana, and I've figured out ways to partner with people from across the aisle in good faith when we could work together on something meaningful that we both believed in. But good faith, yeah. When you think about Mitch McConnell, good faith is not the first thing that comes to mind. Do you see where he said that it turns out his whole stand on how you shouldn't have a Supreme Court nominee in an election year, he got to change his mind if the election year is 2020, right? They're not even pretending. The cynicism is unbelievable. And so if you don't have a good faith partner, then your only option is to outmaneuver them. Now, here's what we have going for us on that front. Most Americans agree with us. Most Americans believe in a comprehensive, humane, bipartisan immigration reform. Okay? Most Americans believe in common sense gun reform. Most Americans believe we ought to raise wages in this country. And most Americans believe in universal health care. So when a senator or a Senate majority, I'll just talk loud. When a Senate majority is getting in the way, I believe one of the best uses of Air Force One is to fly it right into the home of one of those senators, right into that home state, get off the plane, and remind all of their voters why there's some daylight between what they want and what their senators want. But what would be even better is not to have that scenario happen, right? And that's why we need to have a nominee with coattails. And we need to make sure that we never treat the presidency like it's the only office that matters. And that's where everybody here comes in. So I guess my time's up, but are we ready to make sure that from the White House to the State House, we have the right kind of leadership in this country? And hopefully that won't be a problem. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, California. Thank you, Fresno County. I'm going to see you on the trial, and I hope you're in your support every step of the way. Thank you.